January 8, 1815. Before dawn, the Louisiana marshland breathes like a living thing. The Mississippi River runs black and white to the west. Spanish moss hangs from cypress trees in gray curtains, motionless in the cold, damp air. The ground is soft, half-frozen mud, the kind that swallows boots and exhausts men before a single shot is fired. Fog clings to the earth in heavy rolling sheets, erasing the horizon, swallowing the sky. Somewhere in that fog, 8,000 British soldiers are forming their lines. They come from the greatest military force on earth. They are the veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, men who had crossed the Alps, stormed fortresses in Spain, and marched all the way into Paris to watch Napoleon's empire collapse. Their redcoats, soaked dark with morning dew, still carry the weight of a decade of European victory. Their bayonets catch no light yet, but they are fixed. They are ready. Their commanders are decorated officers of empire, men who have measured the world in miles of conquest and have never once been stopped by the ragged militias of a former colony. Across an open sugarcane field, less than half a mile away, a very different army waits. They are not a professional force, not in the way the British are. They number around 5,000 at the main line, a mosaic of frontier riflemen from Kentucky and Tennessee, free men of color from New Orleans, Choctaw warriors, Spanish militia from the Canary Islands, a band of pirates from Barataria Bay, and a thin line of regular United States Army troops. They are armed with weapons ranging from precision long rifles to repurposed artillery pieces seized from a swamp smuggler's arsenal. Many have never fought in a pitched battle. Several have never worn a uniform. What they have, however, is this: a wall. Not stone, not iron. A fortification of earth and timber and cotton bales, 5 feet high and half a mile wide, stretching from the banks of the Mississippi River to the edge of an impassable cypress swamp. Behind it stands a man who has already beaten the odds so many times that destiny seems to have grown tired of trying to stop him. Andrew Jackson. 1 against 1, the armies are mismatched. But the battlefield? The battlefield belongs entirely to the Americans. This single morning, January 8, 1815, would become one of the most lopsided victories in the history of modern warfare. A battle in which a professional European army, blooded in the greatest conflict the world had ever seen, was shattered in less than 30 minutes of open field fighting by men they had underestimated at every turn. It would become the founding myth of American military identity, the battle that convinced a young nation it could stand with empires and win. It would also be fought 2 weeks after the war it was supposed to decide had already officially ended. But no one in that fog knew that yet. And so, 8,000 British soldiers stepped forward into the darkness, certain of victory, and walked directly into the moment that changed America forever. To understand what brought two armies to face each other across a half-mile of Louisiana sugarfield in the dead of winter, you have to go back to the fault lines that had been cracking through Anglo-American relations for more than a decade before the first shot was fired. The War of 1812 was not a simple conflict. It was not a war of invasion in the traditional sense, nor was it a war of pure ideology. It was born from a tangle of humiliation, economic pressure, territorial ambition, and the unfinished business left over from the American Revolution itself. Britain, locked in its existential struggle against Napoleon, had been intercepting American merchant ships on the open Atlantic and impressing American sailors, pulling them from their own vessels at gunpoint and forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy. To a young republic, barely 30 years old, still arguing about what kind of nation it wanted to be, this was an intolerable insult. Congress declared war on Great Britain in June of 1812, and the conflict that followed was messy, inconclusive, and painful for both sides. The Americans had hoped for quick conquests. They looked north toward Canada and believed, many of them loudly, with great confidence, that the British provinces there would fall quickly, perhaps even welcome annexation. They were wrong. American armies crossed into Canada and were repulsed repeatedly. The regular United States Army in 1812 was a poorly organized, underfunded institution led in many cases by aging Revolutionary War veterans whose best years were behind them. The frontier militias, so romanticized in American political discourse, proved unreliable in pitched battle. They fought bravely when defending their own soil, but often refused to cross national borders, citing legal technicalities at the worst possible moments. Meanwhile, the British pressed hard. In August of 1814, a British force marched into Washington, D.C. and burned the White House, the Capitol building, and most of the government's public structures. It was a calculated act of destruction, intended as both punishment and demonstration. The President James Madison fled the Capitol with his wife Dolly, who famously saved the portrait of George Washington before the building was torched. The city was left smoldering under a summer sky, and across the young republic, the question hardened. Could America actually fight this war? The answer would depend on what happened next, and what happened next was New Orleans. The city was, in 1814, arguably the most strategically vital piece of real estate in North America. Positioned at the mouth of the Mississippi River, it was the single point through which the agricultural wealth of the entire American interior flowed to the sea. The cotton, grain, furs, and commodities produced by a dozen western states and territories moved through New Orleans on their way to market. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the economic lifeblood of half a continent. The British understood this perfectly. Capture New Orleans, and they could potentially strangle the American economy, leverage a peace settlement that stripped the United States of its western territories, and perhaps even restore to their own empire a piece of the vast North American interior that they had ceded at the end of the Revolution 30 years before. The man Britain sent to lead this campaign was Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, a calculating officer who had orchestrated the burning of Washington and who held what can only be described as a personal contempt for the American Republic. Cochrane had served in the West Indies and had seen the American privateers damage British trade. He had watched American political figures taunt the empire. He believed the United States to be a weak, disorganized, and fundamentally ungovernable nation, a collection of squabbling factions held together by rhetoric and not much else. He had written to his superiors in London that taking New Orleans would be, in his estimation, a matter of little difficulty. The city's defenses were poor. The surrounding terrain was impenetrable swamp, which would shield a British advance from any serious counterattack. And the local population, a complex mix of French Creoles, Spanish colonists, free people of color, and newly arrived American settlers, he did not believe would unite in any coherent resistance. On nearly every one of these assessments, Cochrane would be proven disastrously wrong. The man standing against him was Andrew Jackson, the commander of the 7th Military District of the United States, and one of the most ferociously single-minded military figures America had yet produced. Jackson had not been educated at West Point. He had not trained in the formal European tradition. What he had done was survive. He had grown up on the Carolinian frontier during the Revolution, had been captured by the British as a teenage boy, had been slashed across the face by a British officer's sword for refusing to shine the man's boots, and had carried the scar and the contempt for the rest of his life. He was not a man who forgave insults from the British crown. He was not a man who forgot them either. By the autumn of 1814, Jackson's reputation had been built largely on ruthlessness. He had crushed the Red Stick Creek Confederation at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama earlier that year in a fight of extraordinary violence, securing the American southern frontier and earning him the nickname among his men and among his enemies, of Old Hickory, for the iron-hard timber of his will. He was tall, angular, permanently unwell with a collection of ailments including a musket ball lodged near his heart from a duel, intestinal parasites from decades of frontier life, and a persistent cough that had plagued him for years. He should not have been a soldier. He looked, at times, like a man death had already begun to dismantle. But he functioned on sheer determination, on the force of a will so strong it seemed to bend the world around it. In late November 1814, Jackson arrived in New Orleans. What he found was not reassuring. The city was beautiful, yes, a jewel of French colonial architecture and Spanish-influenced streets, already acquiring the layered character that would define it for centuries. But it was also vulnerable. The British could approach from at least 5 different waterways. The local population was divided in its loyalties. The Louisiana militia was untested, and there were those in the city's political establishment who quietly whispered that perhaps accommodation with the British would be less dangerous than resistance. Jackson had no patience for whispers. He declared martial law. He seized supplies and weapons. He reached out, and this was the move that would prove decisive, to every armed faction in the region willing to fight. The Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen who had followed him south, the free men of color, the Battalion d'Orléans, whose request to fight had been rejected by previous American commanders, and who Jackson welcomed with the words that, in the defense of New Orleans, there would be no distinction of color. The Choctaw warriors under their own leaders, and most controversially, the Barratarian pirates under their flamboyant commander, Jean Lafitte, men who had been declared criminals by the U.S. government only weeks before, men who controlled a black market trading empire out of the Louisiana marshes, and who brought with them something Jackson desperately needed: cannons, ammunition, and expert gunners. Lafitte had actually been approached by the British first. Cochrane's officers had rowed into Barataria Bay and offered the pirate chief money, a pardon, and a commission in the Royal Navy. Lafitte had listened politely, sent the papers to the Louisiana governor, and then offered his services to the Americans instead. His reasoning was never entirely made clear. Perhaps he simply preferred to stay where he was. Perhaps he had a genuine attachment to New Orleans, the city whose markets he had exploited for years. Perhaps he understood, with the pragmatic intelligence of a man who survived by reading situations accurately, that the British offer was the kind of deal that ended with a man on the wrong side of a rope once he'd served his purpose. Whatever the reason, Jackson accepted. He had no choice. And Lafitte's men, with their precise knowledge of the Louisiana waterways and their well-maintained artillery, would prove to be among the most effective fighters behind the cotton bale ramparts on January 8th. The British did not simply appear out of the Louisiana fog. Their approach to New Orleans was a weeks-long operation of remarkable logistical ambition, and it nearly worked. Cochrane's fleet arrived in the Gulf of Mexico in early December 1814. It was an imposing force, over 50 warships, transport vessels, and support craft carrying approximately 10,000 men. These were not fresh recruits. Many of them had served in the Peninsular War against Napoleon's forces in Spain and Portugal, some of the most brutal and tactically sophisticated fighting of the era. The veterans among them had fought at Salamanca, Vitoria, and the siege of Badajoz. They had marched thousands of miles through hostile terrain, had stormed fortified cities, had faced French regulars who gave no quarter and asked for none. They did not consider American frontier riflemen and Louisiana militia to be a serious military threat. But getting to New Orleans proved harder than anticipated. The approaches to the city were defended by water. Lake Borgne, a shallow tidal lake east of New Orleans, blocked the most direct route. The British solution was to cross it with a naval assault force, longboats rowing through December wind and choppy water to engage the small American gunboat squadron positioned to contest the passage. On December 14th, they succeeded. American Commodore Thomas A.P. Catesby Jones and his small flotilla of 5 gunboats were overwhelmed after a fierce fight, with Jones himself wounded and captured. It was a British tactical victory, but it came at a cost: time. The crossing of Lake Bourne took days. The boats were rowed by exhausted sailors. Supply chains stretched impossibly thin over the shallow, frozen waterway. The main army, once landed on the eastern shore, had to slog through miles of marsh and reed and ice to reach dry ground. Thousands of men, horses, and artillery pieces moved through terrain that was barely passable even without an enemy contesting it. Officers wrote home in frustration. The distance was short on paper. In reality, it was a week of miserable, grinding movement through some of the most hostile terrain in North America. Jackson, meanwhile, had not been idle. He had established a series of defensive positions south of New Orleans, probing with cavalry patrols to track British movements. On December 23rd, when his scouts reported that the British advance elements had reached the Rodriguez Canal, a dry drainage ditch that cut across the approach to the city roughly 5 miles south, Jackson made a decision that surprised nearly everyone. He attacked. Rather than wait behind his defenses, Jackson launched a night assault on the British advance camp. The attack was chaotic. It was, frankly, disorganized at several key moments, but it achieved exactly what he intended. The British, who had not expected aggression, were shaken. Their advance slowed, their commanders became cautious, and Jackson bought time, the one commodity he needed more than anything else. He fell back to the Rodriguez Canal and ordered it made into a fortress. The Rodriguez Canal was not impressive to look at. It was roughly 10 feet wide and 4 feet deep, dry in winter, cutting from the Mississippi River on the west to the edge of the cypress swamp on the east, a total distance of about half a mile. To a military engineer trained in the European tradition, it was nothing. It was not stone. It was not mortar. It was a drainage ditch through a sugar plantation. Jackson turned it into a killing ground. Working through the cold December nights and into January, his men threw up the earth from the canal into a rampart on its northern bank. Timber was dragged from nearby structures. Cotton bales from the plantation were stacked into the walls. Artillery pieces were positioned at intervals across the entire length of the line, each with a clear field of fire over the open sugar field to the south. The Barratarian gunners under Lafitte's lieutenants, Dominique Huot and Renato Bellucci, both veterans of European naval warfare, sighted their pieces with professional precision. The rampart grew daily, first 3 feet, then 4, then a full 5 feet of compacted earth, timber, and packed cotton bale. The ground south of the canal was the key. It was, militarily speaking, a gift. The approach was an open plain, roughly 3/4 of a mile long, from the British forward positions to the American rampart. It was flanked on the west by the Mississippi River, where Jackson had also positioned warships to provide enfilading fire, and on the east by the cypress swamp, which was simply impassable to any organized military formation. This meant that any British attack had to come straight across that open plain, in a compressed corridor that funneled troops directly into the American guns. There was no room to maneuver, no possibility of flanking. An attacking force could not spread wide. They could only come forward, in tightly packed columns, exactly the formation that artillery and massed rifle fire were designed to destroy. Jackson walked the line every day. He checked gun emplacements personally. He spoke to his men by name, the riflemen from Tennessee who had followed him since Horseshoe Bend, the New Orleans militia who were fighting for their own city, the free black volunteers who understood better than most what British control of this territory might mean for their fragile freedoms. He was not warm by nature. He was sharp-tongued, quick to anger, demanding in the way of men who hold impossibly high standards for themselves, and assume the same of everyone around them. But he had a quality that great commanders share across all eras and cultures. His men believed he would find a way to win. Across the field, the British prepared for a very different kind of battle. The command structure on the British side had grown complicated in the weeks since the campaign began. Cochrane's naval force and the army operated under separate chains of command, and the two men at the top did not always agree. The initial ground commander, General John Keane, had actually reached the Rodriguez Canal on December 23rd with only a fraction of his force, and had been close enough to march on New Orleans before Jackson reinforced his line. Some historians have argued that if Keane had pushed forward that day, he might have reached the city before the defenses were ready. But Keane was cautious. He had seen the night attack on his camp. He was uncertain of American strength. He waited. His replacement arrived in late December. General Sir Edward Pakenham, the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington himself, came with all the authority and prestige of Britain's greatest military family. Wellington had once called him the ablest man I know. Pakenham was a distinguished officer with an impressive record in the Peninsular War, a man of personal courage and professional competence. He looked at the American position and understood immediately that it was formidable. He understood that a direct frontal assault across open ground against prepared artillery emplacements was a dangerous proposition. He ordered probing attacks in early January to test the American defenses. They confirmed what his reconnaissance had suggested. The American line was solid. The artillery was well positioned. The riflemen behind the rampart were skilled. Pakenham had options. He could have moved more slowly, constructing his own siege works and trying to neutralize the American artillery through counter-battery fire before committing infantry. He could have attempted to find a way around, though the geography largely precluded this. He could have waited for his full force to concentrate and develop a more complex plan. Instead, under pressure from Cochrane and the broader strategic imperative, the British needed this city and needed it before winter was out. Pakenham chose to attack. His plan was not without cleverness. It had multiple components designed to overwhelm the Americans from several directions simultaneously. The main assault would be a frontal push across the open plain with his best troops in two columns, aimed at the left center of the American line. A secondary force, crossing the Mississippi River to the west bank, would seize American artillery batteries there and use those guns to fire across the river into the flank of Jackson's main position, disrupting the defenders at the moment of the frontal attack. A diversionary assault on the Cypress Swamp side would prevent Jackson from concentrating his full strength against the main thrust. It was, on paper, a reasonable plan. In the cold dark before dawn on January 8th, Pakenham's soldiers formed their lines. They were impressive to look at. The 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, in their kilts, moved into position with the grinding precision of men who had drilled for years. The 95th Rifles, in their famous green jackets, crouched at the advance. The 44th East Essex Regiment carried the assault ladders and the bundles of sugarcane that would be thrown into the canal to serve as bridges for the main attack. There was one problem. The 44th had forgotten the fascines. The bundles of cane meant to fill the canal so troops could cross. They had been left behind at the overnight camp. The officer responsible for ensuring they were brought forward had somehow, in the darkness and confusion, failed to do it. When Pakenham was informed of this, it was too late to halt the attack. The troops were in position. The plan was in motion. The night before, the soldiers who would die in the morning sat around their fires and spoke in low voices. Highlanders sang fragments of Gaelic songs, the words half remembered from childhoods in Scotland, before the army took them. Yorkshire infantrymen cleaned their rifles for the fourth or fifth time, more ritual than necessity, a way of keeping the hands busy when the mind was moving toward places it did not want to go. Young officers read letters from home in the guttering light. Some prayed. Some ate whatever was available, knowing that fear has a way of making food taste like paper. Some simply sat and stared into the fire, the oldest activity of men on the night before battle, unchanged across all the centuries of human conflict. The silent reckoning between the men you were before the sun went down and whatever you would become when it rose again. On the American side, similar fires burned. A Kentucky rifleman named Thomas, according to a pension account preserved in the National Archives, set up most of the night sharpening his knife. Not his rifle, that was already clean and loaded. The knife, he said later, because the rhythm of the whetstone was the only thing that kept his hands from shaking. A New Orleans merchant turned militiaman named Francois wrote a letter to his wife in French, sealed it, and gave it to a friend to deliver if needed. The free men of color who formed the Bataillon d'Orléans stood at their section of the line in the pre-dawn dark, knowing that the stakes of this fight were different for them than for anyone else on the field, that the city they were defending contained their homes, their families, and their fragile freedom, and that losing it might mean the erasure of everything their community had built. Jackson made his last inspection of the line after midnight. He moved from position to position in the dark, speaking briefly to commanders, checking angles of fire, asking questions no one else thought to ask. When he was satisfied, he returned to his headquarters, a modest plantation house behind the line, and sat down to wait. He did not sleep. Phase sleep. Phase 1. The silence. Before dawn, the fog lay over everything. The Mississippi, rolling west of the line, made no sound that carried. The cypress swamp to the east breathed a cold, wet silence. The sugarcane field, stripped of its harvest months before, stretched south in frozen furrows of earth, empty and gray and still. A sentry on the American rampart could see perhaps 20 yards into the murk. Beyond that, nothing. Just the fog and the knowledge of what the fog was hiding. Then it began. The British signal rockets, Congreve rockets, streaking fire across the pre-dawn sky, climbed above the mist and burst in orange and white, arcing over the field. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, or close enough to it, and the signal meant that the columns were moving. For a moment, the rockets hung in the air above the fog, and every man on the American rampart saw them and knew. Jackson appeared on the line. His voice was flat and carried in the cold air. "Don't waste a single shot," he told the riflemen. "Make every ball count." They waited. The sound reached them before the sight. It was not the sound of men moving. It was the sound of an army, the low, continuous rumble of thousands of feet on frozen mud, the clinking of accoutrements, the rhythmic strike of boots that merged at distance into something like the sound of a slow, enormous machine. Then the drums, the British advance drums, rolling in the fog, growing louder. And beneath the drums, just audible, the skirling of the Highlanders' pipes, the 93rd Sutherland's regimental march, a sound completely alien to this Louisiana morning, a sound from Scottish mountain and moor, transported here to these American flatlands by the long arm of empire. The fog began to thin. They appeared in it slowly, at first as darker shapes within the gray, then as recognizable silhouettes, then as men. Thousands of them, coming straight across the field in tight columns, the 93rd on the British left, in their brilliant red coats, the ladder-bearers of the 44th angling toward the canal, the light infantry skirmishers advancing at the front in extended order. Their bayonets caught the first gray light of dawn and held it. It was, by any measure, a magnificent and terrifying sight. Phase 2. The guns open up. The American artillery fired first. Battery number 3, positioned near the center of the line and commanded by Dominique Huot, former privateer, former sailor under the French flag, current resident of the Louisiana marshes, and entirely unconcerned about the philosophical differences between piracy and warfare, sent the first American cannon shot across the field at precisely the moment the British columns came into effective range. The shot was accurate. It took a file of men in the front rank of the lead column, and the hole it made was immediately closed by the men behind stepping forward to fill it. That was what trained soldiers did. UO did not stop because men fell. UO stepped into the space they had occupied and kept moving. The British had been doing this for years. They had closed ranks on the fields of Europe against French artillery, against Spanish artillery, against artillery far more numerous and sophisticated than anything Jackson had assembled behind his mud wall. They kept coming. But then, the rest of the American batteries opened fire simultaneously. 8 artillery positions, each with 1 or more pieces, each firing into that compressed corridor of men. The sound was not the sound of individual shots. It was a continuous, rolling thunder, a percussion that hit the body as much as the ears, something felt in the chest and the teeth and the base of the skull. The field south of the canal disappeared in smoke and fire, and the screams of men and horses. Shot after shot tore through the British columns at distances of 200 yards, 150 yards, 100. At those ranges, a cannonball did not simply punch a hole in a formation. It bowled through it like a stone thrown through a row of candles. The columns staggered, but they did not stop. They were brave men, a Kentucky rifleman named Willis would write in a letter preserved in a Lexington archive. I will not pretend to say otherwise. They kept coming, and I respected them for it even while I was doing my best to shoot them. The British skirmishers in front returned fire, their muzzle flashes bright in the half-light. Balls pinged and chunked against the earthen rampart. One struck a cotton bale and threw a cloud of white fiber into the air that drifted across the defenders like snow. But the rampart absorbed the fire. The defenders were protected to their chests. The British were in the open. Phase 3. The rifles. At 300 yards, the Tennessee and Kentucky long riflemen opened up. This is the moment that needs to be understood in its full technical context, because it is not the same as understanding that rifles were fired. The American frontier long rifle, often called the Kentucky rifle though it was made in Pennsylvania and carried by men from a dozen different states, was a weapon fundamentally unlike the British Brown Bess musket that equipped most of the redcoat infantry. The Brown Bess was a smooth-bore flintlock with an effective range of perhaps 100 yards under ideal conditions, and its primary virtue was that it could be loaded quickly and fired in coordinated volleys by large formations of men. It was a weapon designed for mass, for discipline, for the European style of battle, where 2 lines of men marched toward each other and exchanged volley fire until one broke. The American rifle was something else entirely. It was a rifled barrel weapon, the spiral grooves in the barrel spinning the ball as it fired, stabilizing it in flight, giving it accuracy at ranges that smoothbore muskets could not approach. In the hands of a trained frontier marksman, it was effective at 300 yards. At 250 yards, it was devastating. A skilled rifleman could pick a specific target and hit it with reasonable consistency. And the men who had followed Jackson down from Tennessee and Kentucky had been hunting deer, bear, and anything else that moved in the American forest since childhood. They had not been trained on parade grounds to fire in disciplined volleys at the word of an officer. They had been trained by hunger and necessity to shoot once and to not miss. They did not miss now. The British officers, identifiable by their uniforms and their position at the fronts and flanks of their columns, went first. This was not random. The American riflemen specifically targeted officers, the men whose loss would disrupt the coordination of the assault. It was not a gentlemanly tactic. It was not the European tradition, where officers on both sides were sometimes accorded a certain informal protection out of professional courtesy. It was the tactic of men who understood that an army without leaders makes poor decisions under fire. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Officers fell in the first minutes. Sergeants tried to fill the void. They fell too. The columns, already being churned by artillery, lost the human structures that held them together. A British soldier named Cooper, whose memoir was published decades later, wrote that he saw the men around me falling in groups, whole files of them going down at a stroke, and the officers who tried to encourage us falling even faster. He had survived Salamanca and Vitoria. He had never, he wrote, seen anything like this. But the most terrifying weapon in the American line was not the rifle. It was a cannon loaded not with ball, but with grape shot. Small iron spheres packed into a canvas bag, spreading in a cone of fire at close range like a giant shotgun blast. When the British columns compressed near the Rodriguez Canal, slowing, searching for the bridges and ladders not facine bundles that had been left behind, the grape shot tore through them at distances of 50 yards, 30 yards, 20 yards. At those distances, the sound of grape shot was not a bang. It was a ripping, tearing sound, the sound of something violent happening to human bodies in large numbers simultaneously. The 44th East Essex, carrying assault ladders but not the canal-crossing bundles, reached the edge of the ditch and found nothing to bridge it with. Their commander, Colonel Thomas Mullins, a man who would be court-martialed for his failure to ensure the fascines were brought forward, was unable to improvise a solution under the concentrated fire of every gun on the American line. The regiment broke. Not immediately, not all at once, but in the way that units break when the cost of moving forward exceeds what even trained soldiers can absorb. First, the front ranks began to slow, then to stop, then the men behind them stopped too, not the momentum that armies require, that invisible force generated by thousands of men moving together toward a common objective, simply evaporated. The 93rd Sutherland Highlanders kept coming. They were, arguably, the finest infantry regiment in the entire British Army. They had fought in the Egyptian campaign under Abercrombie, had served in the Cape Colony, had fought at the siege of Badajoz. They wore their kilts over their red coats in the January cold of Louisiana, which must have been extraordinary misery, and they came forward to their death with a discipline that was almost beyond comprehension. Their pipe major played. Their ranks closed over fallen men. They reached within 100 yards of the American line. Jackson watched from the rampart. "Give it to them, boys," he said, according to witnesses. "Let's finish this." Phase 4. The collapse. The 93rd Sutherland walked into a wall of fire. At 100 yards, every rifle that could bear on their position opened fire simultaneously. At the same moment, the American artillery switched to canister, the close-range anti-personnel ammunition that turned a cannon into something resembling a massive blunderbuss, spraying hundreds of small iron balls in a spreading cloud. The noise was beyond description. Men who were there and wrote about it later reached, without exception, for the same words: terrible, awful, beyond imagination. The smoke from the American line was so thick that the gun crews loaded and fired by feel and memory, unable to see the targets they were destroying. The Highlanders took it. They took it for minutes that felt, to everyone on both sides, like hours. They closed their ranks and kept moving forward. Men went down in files of 4 and 5 at a stroke, and the men behind them stepped over the bodies and kept walking into the smoke. It was courage at a level that seems, reading about it, almost impossible. The courage of men who had given themselves entirely to a discipline that made their bodies keep moving when every instinct for survival was screaming at them to run. They had been trained to advance under fire. They advanced. They fell by the hundreds, and they advanced. But no human courage was equal to that volume of fire at that range, with no cover and no means of crossing the obstacle at the end of it. The 93rd stopped. It stopped. It happened within perhaps 50 yards of the American line. A regiment of over 900 men, reduced in those minutes to something less than half their number, simply could not absorb any more. The Highlanders, those who still could, sought cover in the shallow drainage furrows and the bodies of their comrades. Their colonel, Robert Dale, was shot from his horse. Their lieutenant colonel, John Patterson, was killed. Their pipe major kept playing for a moment after the regiment halted, and the sound of the pipes over that carnage was, by the account of American soldiers who heard it, one of the strangest and most affecting sounds of their lives. Then the pipe major too went down. On the British right, the secondary attack toward the Cypress Swamp was meeting similar catastrophe. The light infantry who had pushed toward the American right flank were channeled by the impenetrable swamp into exactly the same narrow corridor as the main attack, and the American defenders there were backed by Choctaw warriors who had fanned into the swamp's edge and were shooting from cover at any British soldier who attempted to move off the main axis of advance. The flanking attack was not a failure. It had simply never been possible. General Pakenham rode forward. This was his response to a battle going wrong, to put himself where the men could see him, to demonstrate by his own presence that the attack was not broken, that the thing could still be done, that a man on a horse moving forward was reason enough for the men around him to move forward too. He had done it before. At Salamanca, he had personally led a charge that had helped turn the battle. He believed in the power of visible leadership, in the idea that a general's body on a horse at the front of a battle was worth 2 regiments of fresh troops. He rode into the fire. He was struck almost immediately. A rifle ball, almost certainly fired by one of the Kentucky long riflemen, caught him in the right arm. He transferred his sword to his left hand and kept riding. He tried to rally the 44th East Essex, to turn them around, to push them back towards the canal. A second ball hit his horse. The horse went down. Pakenham struggled free of it. An aide brought him another horse. He mounted. A third shot struck him, this one mortal. A canister ball or a rifle ball, the accounts differ, catching him in the groin and lower spine. He was carried from the field by his staff and died shortly afterward under an oak tree, reportedly with the words, "Loss of the battle," still on his lips. General Gibbs, commanding the main assault column, was also shot and mortally wounded in the same minutes. General Keane, on the British left, was wounded as well. In perhaps 30 minutes of frontal assault, the British Army in front of the Rodriguez Canal had lost all 3 of its senior ground commanders. Phase 5. The West Bank and the Decision. While the carnage unfolded on the main field, the British plan's secondary component, the crossing of the Mississippi to attack the American batteries on the West Bank, was actually succeeding. Colonel William Thornton's force had crossed the river in the pre-dawn hours and struck the American positions on the West Bank with controlled aggression, routing the Louisiana militia there and seizing the artillery batteries. Had those guns been turned in time on Jackson's main line, they might have changed everything. A competent artillerist with even 2 or 3 of those captured pieces could have raked the American rampart from the flank and forced the defenders to divert, creating exactly the moment of disorder that the frontal attack needed to succeed. But Thornton moved too slowly. By the time his men controlled the West Bank guns, the main assault had already collapsed. The window had closed. On the East Bank, the remains of the British force were pinned down or retreating. General John Lambert, the only British general still unwounded, inherited command of a catastrophe. He assessed what remained of the attacking force, the 93rd shattered, the 44th broken, dozens of officers dead, and made the only rational decision available. He ordered the retreat. The firing died away. Not all at once. Isolated shots continued for some minutes, American riflemen targeting any British soldier still moving forward. But the main action was over. It had lasted, from the first British cannon signal to the retreat order, less than 30 minutes. The silence that followed was almost physical. After the sustained roar of perhaps 40 or 50 artillery pieces and thousands of small arms firing continuously, the quiet came down over the sugar field like a weight. Smoke lay across the plain in thick white and gray layers, slowly moving west in the faint morning breeze. Underneath the smoke, the field was covered with the red coats of the fallen. Jackson stood on the rampart and looked out at the field. He said nothing, according to the accounts that survive. He looked for a long time at what had happened. The numbers, when they were counted, were almost beyond comprehension. The British dead, wounded, and missing on January 8, 1815, numbered approximately 2,037 men, over 2,000 casualties in less than half an hour of action on the main front. Of these, perhaps 285 were killed outright, around 1,265 were wounded, and nearly 500 were captured or missing. The figure most often cited in British accounts was simply over 2,000, and even the officers who wrote after the fact seemed unable to fully absorb the arithmetic of it. These were men who had survived years of Napoleonic warfare. They had absorbed losses at Badajoz and Burgos and on the roads through the Spanish interior and had kept going. They had not seen and could not have anticipated what American rifle fire and American artillery could do at close range in a compressed space against a formation that could not move laterally. The 93rd Sutherland Highlanders were gutted. The regiment that had marched into the field 900 strong came back with fewer than 500 men who could stand. Their colors were riddled with ball. Their officers were gone, more than 30 of them killed or wounded in those minutes of final advance. The regimental sergeant major, who had served for 19 years, was found dead within 50 yards of the American rampart. He had been identified by a set of regimental buttons still sewn to his coat and by a small Bible in his breast pocket with his name written on the flyleaf. On the American side, 13 killed, 39 wounded, no prisoners taken. The disproportion was so extreme that American newspapers, when they published the figures days later, were accused by some British partisans of fabrication. The numbers have been disputed in some particulars. British records showed somewhat higher losses than American accounts initially suggested, and American casualties on the West Bank, where the Louisiana militia was routed by Thornton, added to the total. But the fundamental reality is not contested. The British suffered catastrophic losses. The Americans suffered almost none. General Pakenham died behind the British lines within an hour of being carried from the field, cradled by his aide-de-camp, and reportedly asking, as he faded, whether the attack had succeeded. His body was preserved for transport back to England in a cask of rum, a grim, practical measure that reflected both British military custom and the logistical realities of the era. He was buried eventually in Ireland, where he had been born, far from the Louisiana field where his ambitions had ended. General Gibbs died the same day. General Keane survived his wound, but took no further part in the campaign. Lambert, now in command of 10,000 men who were no longer capable of any aggressive action, requested a ceasefire on January 9th to collect the dead and wounded still lying on the field. Jackson granted it. British stretcher parties moved through the sugarcane furrows in the gray January morning, collecting what remained of the assault columns. Many of the dead had been lying in freezing mud for hours. The wounded who had survived the night had done so by the narrowest of margins, some pulling themselves behind the bodies of fallen comrades for shelter from the fire that had continued to rake the field during the initial confusion of the retreat. On the American line, Jackson's soldiers walked among the positions they had held and found them largely intact. The rampart had been hit repeatedly. There were scars in the cotton bales and chunks of earth gouged from the parapet, but the structure itself was sound. The artillery pieces were all functional. The ammunition supply was still adequate. Jackson inspected the battlefield personally on January 9th. He had not slept. He would not sleep for many more hours. He was everywhere that day, moving from position to position, speaking to his officers, writing dispatches, already planning for the British counterattack that he was certain must come. He had learned at Horseshoe Bend that a beaten enemy was still dangerous, that the moment of apparent victory was also the moment of greatest vulnerability if the victor relaxed his guard. He refused to relax it. He walked the field south of the canal in the gray morning, and what he saw there affected him in ways that he did not often acknowledge publicly. Jackson was not a man who shared his inner life readily, not a man given to recorded reflection. But a member of his staff, John Reed, who was writing a biography of Jackson at the time, it would be completed after Jackson's death, wrote that the general walked slowly among the fallen, and his face bore an expression I had not seen on it before, which I could only describe as the face of a man reckoning with the full cost of what he had done and what had been done to others. He stopped at the body of a Highlander sergeant who had fallen within 30 yards of the rampart, close enough that the man must have died, still believing he might reach it. The sergeant was perhaps 30 years old. His rifle, the Brown Bess that was regulation issue, lay still in his hand. Jackson looked at him for a moment, then turned and walked back to the line without saying anything. Anything. The British Army remained south of New Orleans for 10 more days, conducting operations and probing for weaknesses, while Lambert awaited reinforcements and reconsidered options. On the West Bank, Thornton's men consolidated their position. Minor skirmishes occurred. Jackson reinforced his defenses and waited, certain the British would try again. They did not. On January 18th, Lambert began withdrawing his forces. The retreat was conducted with the same professional efficiency that had characterized British military operations throughout the campaign. The army simply moved backward in good order through the same marshes it had come through, loading onto boats, crossing Lake Bourne, and returning to the fleet. By January 27th, the last British soldier had gone. New Orleans was safe. The Treaty of Ghent, which formally ended the War of 1812, had been signed on December 24, 1814, 15 days before the battle that both sides had fought as though the war's outcome depended on it. The treaty had been ratified and was awaiting official exchange when the guns fired on January 8th. The news simply had not reached Louisiana in time. Slow ships, winter seas, the vast distances of an era before telegraph. These are the mundane reasons that over 2,000 men died or were wounded for a strategic objective that had ceased to be relevant before the first British rocket climbed into the Louisiana fog. History does not consider this an irony so much as a lesson about the nature of information in war. Battles were always, in every era, fought partly on the basis of outdated intelligence. The gap between when decisions were made and when their consequences arrived was simply wider in 1815 than it would be in later centuries, and the gap at New Orleans was wide enough to contain a catastrophe. But this is not to say the battle was without consequence. It had consequences that echoed for generations, changing the political landscape of a young nation and reshaping the relationship between the United States and the wider world in ways that no peace treaty fully captured. The most immediate consequence was the survival of the Louisiana Purchase. The Treaty of Ghent restored all territories to their pre-war status. Technically, the British had no claim on New Orleans regardless of the battle's outcome. But international treaties are interpreted through power. A British army in possession of New Orleans, with its grip on the Mississippi River and the trade routes of the American interior, would have negotiated from a position that might have produced very different results than the status quo antebellum terms that were actually agreed. The war was over, but geography is a perpetual argument, and Britain had good reason to press its claims. The victory at New Orleans removed that argument entirely. The second consequence was Andrew Jackson himself. The man who walked the field on the morning of January 9, 1815, exhausted and unslept, looking at what his wall of earth and cotton and mismatched fighters had done to the finest infantry in the world, would go on to become the 7th President of the United States. His victory at New Orleans was the central fact of his political identity, the foundation on which he built an entire mythology of American democratic power. The idea that ordinary frontiermen, fighting in defense of their own soil, were the equal of any professional European army. This was not entirely true, as a strict military analysis of the battle shows. Geography and the British failure to bring their canal-crossing equipment substantially explain the disproportion of casualties. But mythology does not require strict accuracy. It requires a powerful image, and the image of Jackson's rampart, of the Kentucky rifleman behind his cotton bale, picking off red-coated officers at 300 yards, was one of the most powerful images in American political life for decades. The battle also accelerated a change in military thinking that had been building since the American Revolution. European commanders had long dismissed American irregular warfare as the desperate improvisation of forces too weak to fight properly. New Orleans forced a re-examination of that assumption. The combination of prepared defensive works, accurate long-range rifle fire, and well-positioned artillery had destroyed a British force in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost that any European engagement model would have predicted. American military thinkers did not immediately draw all the correct lessons from this. The Civil War, fought 46 years later, would prove that. But the seed of understanding about what terrain and accurate rifle fire could do to massed infantry was planted at New Orleans and would grow. For the British, the defeat at New Orleans was absorbed with the efficiency of an empire that had lost battles before and would lose them again. Pakenham's death was mourned. The failure was analyzed, attributed to the absence of the fascines, to the coordination failure between the East and West Bank attacks, to the underestimation of American defensive capability. Within a generation, most of the officers who had been there were dead, and the battle had receded in British military memory relative to the vastly larger canvas of the Napoleonic Wars. Wellington's victories at Salamanca and Waterloo overshadowed everything. In America, the battle grew. By the time Andrew Jackson ran for president in 1828, New Orleans was not merely a battle, it was a creation story. It was the moment when the young republic had proved itself against the old world, when the militia democracy had beaten the professional empire, when the ragged and the brave had beaten the polished and the powerful. That this narrative simplified a complex military reality mattered less than the fact that it was emotionally true to the Americans who told it. They had been threatened, they had been doubted, and they had prevailed. Jean Lafitte disappeared into history after the battle, pardoned by President Madison for his service, and then disappearing back into the Gulf waters and the privateering life, becoming one of the great ghost figures of American folklore, the pirate who helped save New Orleans, whose later life remains genuinely mysterious, who died at some point in the Caribbean under circumstances that were never entirely established. His guns, sighted by Dominique Huot and Renato Bellucci on the Rodriguez Canal, had fired their part in the battle, and then he was gone. The Rodriguez Canal itself was filled in years later, as the city grew south. The sugar plantation over which the battle was fought was absorbed into the expanding New Orleans metropolis. The precise location of the American rampart became the subject of historical debate as the landscape changed. Centuries later, the Chalmette battlefield, now part of Jean Lafitte National Historical Park, preserves the memory of the morning when the Louisiana marshland decided the shape of a continent. The field is quiet now, flat, green, stretching from the levee of the Mississippi toward the trees at the edge of the swamp. Visitors come and stand where the rampart stood and look south across the open ground and try to imagine what came across it in the fog of that January morning. It is hard to imagine. It always is. The ground is peaceful now. The silence over it is the silence of a place where something enormous happened so long ago that the earth has forgotten to hold the memory in any visible form, keeping it only in the soft pull of the Mississippi beside the levee. In the way the Spanish moss moves in the morning wind, in the particular stillness of the cold that settles here in January, different from other cold, particular to this ground. They came across this field certain of victory. They walked into the darkness, into the fog, into the Louisiana morning, with everything an empire could give them: experience, discipline, courage, the long weight of European military tradition pressing them forward. They had beaten Napoleon's best. They had stormed cities of stone. They had marched to the ends of the world under the crescent of their empire's banner. And they were stopped by a ditch, and a wall of mud and cotton, and men who did not miss. That is the whole of it. That is the lesson the field teaches, if you stand in it long enough to hear it, that courage and tradition and training are not enough, if the ground itself is against you, and if the men on the other side of the wall have something to fight for that you cannot take away from them. The fog burned off the field by mid-morning on January 8, 1815. The sun came out over Louisiana, the river ran west, and America, young and half-formed, and entirely uncertain of what it was going to become, looked out over a field it had held, and understood, for one blazing, clarifying moment, exactly who it was.